All right, so why don't we get started? So we're on chapter 26. Now, the last verse of chapter 25, well, let's go back to the last two verses. First in verse 43, now David had taken Ahinoam of Jezreel, so both of them became his wives. We had finished the story about Abigail. And then we have this one little verse that says, in addition to Abigail, he took another wife whose name was Ahinoam from Jezreel. And this is thought to be not the Jezreel of the Jezreel Valley in the north, but a town of Jezreel somewhere in the southern Hebron Hills. It's not clear exactly where, but that's the idea. And then we have the last verse. Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Palti, son of Laish from Galim. The way the chapter is divided, it puts this last verse, it sounds like the last two verses are about David's marriage, okay? So we have, on the one hand, we have Abigail and then Achinoam, and then we find out that the wife that he had, Michal, has now been given to somebody else. However, and I think I explained this in the past, the chapter divisions are a Christian addition from the Middle Ages. And sometimes, by the way, even though it's a Christian addition, I find that in the Jewish Bible, the chapters sometimes are divided a little differently, like one verse off in this direction or not. In this case, our chapter divisions are the same. However, we have a different kind of division that is much older than the chapter division, which is kind of paragraphs, but it's not a very practical kind of division because there's no numbers to the paragraphs or sections or something like that. Where you see the sections because there are spaces, new paragraphs, that kind of thing in the way it is written. And what you see here then is that the new paragraph or the new story begins with the last verse of chapter 25. So in other words, the story from last week, Abigail's story, ends with the marriage of Abigail and then the marriage of Ahinoam. This week's story begins with the fact that Saul had given Michal to somebody else. Okay, so I really understand why the chapter division puts the verses together, kind of like saying, well, now we're talked about he married Abigail. Well, let's throw in all the other people that David had a marriage relationship with. So he had a second wife, Ahinoam, and then he got rid of his first wife. Well, actually, Saul got rid of his first wife for him and gave her to someone else. But if you look at the way the paragraph is, what that is saying, then this information about Saul giving Michal, his daughter, who was David's wife, and doesn't say he had been David's wife, but she was David's wife, to this other fellow, is connected in a way, or it's an important piece of information for the story that comes next, okay? And I actually like that way of looking at it better. And so as we read chapter 26, let's keep that in mind and figure out what's going on here, okay? And we'll start reading from chapter 26, verse 1. The Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah and said, David is hiding in the hill of Hachilah facing Yesimon. Okay, now, here in my Bible, Yeshimon. And here in my Bible, it says Yeshimon as if it's the name of a place, but Yeshimon can also come from the word Shmama, which is like an open, empty place, okay? But whatever it is, let's assume it is a place called Yeshimon, and this is where David is hiding, and we have the Ziphites coming. Now, who are the Ziphites? They come from Ziph, and we know that there's a Ziph desert. We see in verse 2, Saul went down at once to the wilderness of Ziph, okay? So the Ziphites are people who live in and around the wilderness of Ziph, which is clearly a big area. And so basically what happens here is the Ziphites are going to Saul and they're ratting on David, saying, oh, now we know he's here and he's hiding. Well, before we go further in the story, let's remember the last time we met the Ziphites. So if you go back to chapter 23, verse 19. Here we have as follows. The Ziphites, okay, again, same fellas, went up to Saul in Gibeah and said, now it's almost the same here because here also the Ziphites went to Saul in Gibeah. Gibeah is Saul's capital for all practical purposes, okay? It's where he has his palace, his house, whatever. And said, now we're going back to chapter 23. David is hiding among us in the strongholds of Koresh at the hill of Hachilah, south of Yeshimon. Same place, okay? Now, first of all, it's the same place. Second of all, it's these Ziphites again. So David already learned that the Ziphites rat on him. So it's kind of odd that he goes back to the same place, which is part of the territory of these Ziphites, the wilderness of Ziph, and again puts himself at the mercy of these people who are certainly not his friends, and who once again rat him out to Saul. So keep that question in mind. The other question I have is, did he actually go back to the exact same place? So in chapter 23, the words are, now it's very interesting because the translation here, well, it makes sense. Okay, the actual Hebrew in verse 19, chapter 23, verse 19, is to the right of the Yeshimon. So what's right and what's left in the Bible? I don't know if you realize this. As Westerners, we are accustomed to thinking of right of facing north, and right being east and left being west. However, in the Bible, you face east. You face to where the sun rises. You face to where, perhaps even more importantly, where civilization began. Remember in the Bible, where are the original people coming into Canaan? Where do they come? They come from the east. They come from the area of Mesopotamia. And so in the Bible, everything faces east, which means the right is south. Okay? So when it says in Hebrew to the right of Yeshimon, it is the south. Now, if in our verse, in chapter 26, verse 1, the word is facing Yeshimon. And there are some commentaries who say that facing, and they find other places in the Bible with a similar word that ends up meaning south. Excuse me, not south, east. So if that's the case, even though it's very similar words and David goes back to the very same place, but he's in a slightly different part, because if now he's in the east, previously he was to the south of this place, okay? So, I don't know, whatever. Let's leave that for now, but it's interesting because on the one hand, he does go back to the same place where indeed he is threatened by the Ziphites. It's still all part of this Ziph area, okay? On the other hand, he goes to a slightly different place. Maybe he thinks he won't be found there. It's likely, in my opinion, it's very likely that he is not suspecting Saul anymore. Now, why is he not suspecting Saul? Because the last time he met Saul, if you recall, this was after they had that interesting encounter in the cave in Ein Gedi. And David and his men are in the rear of the cave. Saul comes in to rest and to wash his feet in a river that's there. And David cuts off the edge of his garment and then confronts him afterwards. And after he confronts him, we have, and I'm going back now to chapter 24, verse 17. When David finished saying these things to Saul, Saul said, "Is that your voice, my son David?" And Saul broke down and wept. And it goes on, and the way that story ends at the end of chapter 24 is that it seems that Saul has regretted his actions against David, and they make a peace, and David swears that he will not harm the house of Saul, and Saul recognizes that David will indeed eventually be king, and it sounds like everything is fine. And then in the middle, of course, we have the story of Abigail and David continuing in the area of the Hebron Hill. So on the one hand, you can say, well, David doesn't go, they still go two separate ways. Saul goes to his capital. David still remains in that Hebron area. So they're not buddies, perhaps. But on the other hand, you can say that perhaps David really did believe that he was not going to be chased anymore. He was cautious, but he didn't be chased. So he could end up going back to that same Ziph wilderness. Okay, so let's continue reading, and then we're going to see a number of other comparisons that we're going to do. Saul went down at once to the wilderness of Ziph, together with 3,000 picked men of Israel, to search for David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on the hill of Achilah, which is, again, we know that this is exactly where David was hiding, which faces Yeshimon by the road. When David, who was then living in the wilderness, learned that Saul had come after him into the wilderness, David sent out scouts and made sure that Saul had come. So he wanted to confirm what he had heard. David went at once to the place where Saul had encamped, and David saw the spot where Saul and his army commander, Abner, son of Ner, lay asleep. Saul lay asleep inside the barricade, and the troops were posted around him. Okay? So one of the things we see is, unlike the way things seem to have ended peacefully at the end of chapter 24, Saul is doing the exact same thing. Last time he also took 3,000 men. Every time he goes after David, he's taking 3,000 men, and it says here, select men. He's taking his best and bravest soldiers. David is there with 600 men. Saul, who is the king, and you can see also from the behavior of the Ziph people that Saul has the backing of the nation. Okay, David is with 600 men who are the dregs of society, and he's running from place to place. He doesn't have backing, even in Judah, in his own tribal place. Who are the Ziphites? They're from Judah. So even within his own tribe, his own extended family, shall we say, he doesn't have backing. And even so, Saul feels the need to bring 3,000 men each time to chase David. Now, also, we know that in the past, when he brought 3,000 men, he failed. So the whole situation is absurd, okay? You see that there's something, and we've seen this in the past, there's something very wrong with Saul. He's really acting like a schizophrenic. It's not clear what's going on, and keep this in mind as we continue reading the story. Okay, so what happens? Here, he comes with his men, his 600 men, and he comes to the place where he sees the encampment. What's the encampment? All the men have created, let's say, a circle, and Saul's in the middle, which is a normal reason. You want to protect the king. You put the king in the center, and you protect the king with all the armed men around to create a sort of barricade, okay? What happens? David spoke up and asked Ahimelech the Hittite. Now, this is not the same Ahimelech that was the priest in Nov. That is a different one. Same name, but this guy's a Hittite. And Abishai, son of Tzruya, Yoav's brother. Okay, now Yoav, we know, is David's main general, or he will become David's main general. Tzruya is David's sister. And it's very interesting. She's a woman. And in the case of both Abishai and Yoav, okay, it always says they're the son of Tzruya, and that's very rare because usually when you mention a man, you always have him being the son of his father. Every time these people are mentioned, they're the son of Tzruya, and she's a woman, and the idea being that because she's David's sister, this is what creates their importance. So it's very important that they relate. The Bible relates to these people as David's nephews, okay? And so that connection is very, very important. Anyway, so he turns to these two, Ahimelech and Abishai, and he says, who will go down with me into the camp to Saul? So that's quite risky. And Abishai answered, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai approached the troops by night and found Saul fast asleep inside the barricade, his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the troops sleeping around him. And Abishai said to David, God has delivered your enemy into your hands today. Let me pin him to the ground with a single thrust of the spear. I will not have to strike him twice. Okay, very similar to what we saw in the cave of En-Gedi, where David was so close to Saul, and the men said to him, why don't you kill him? If you kill him, we solve our problem. Okay, here it's the same kind of thing. Here it's a little crazy though, because they're able to approach this camp and nobody hears them. Okay, but David said no. David said to Abishai, don't do him violence. No one can lay hands on the Lord's anointed with impunity. We see the same thing that David said previously, how important it is, even though Saul is clearly doing terrible things right now, the very fact of him running after David is very sinful, yet he is still an anointed of God, and therefore David does not want to harm him. And David went on, as the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him down, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go down to battle and perish. Now we know, in fact, what happens to Saul is that he dies in battle. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. So here, David is articulating a very, very important theological point, okay? That Saul may be deserving of punishment of death, but it's not for him to execute it because he is the anointed of God. Therefore, it is God and only God who can do this. And yet, also, he has an amazing faith, and we'll see this later on as he speaks, that despite the fact that that his problems could be solved if he killed him, and yet he has a faith that he doesn't need that. Okay, that God will continue to save him. He doesn't have to do the deed and kill Saul. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Just take the spear and the water jar at his head, and let's be off. So it's very similar to what he did in the cave, where he cut off a piece of the garment. He's basically leaving a message. He's going to take away his spirit, leaving a message saying, I was here. I could have killed you in a heartbeat, and I didn't. Okay. So David took away the spear and the water jar at Saul's head, and they left. No one saw or knew or woke up. All remained asleep. A deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. Okay. And this is very, very important. Okay. David comes down. He takes this enormous risk. They could wake up. They could kill him. They're very outnumbered. It's just him and Abishai. Okay. And there's 3,000 men surrounding. So it really takes a risk. But here scripture tells us what we are suspecting all along, that, as we said, it is the Lord who keeps protecting David. And here, the vehicle of that protection is the fact that it is the Lord who created such a deep sleep that even though, and I'm sure they were quiet, but still, the sentries are supposed to be hearing the quietest thing. They're supposed to be staying awake. And yet there was something supernatural about that sleep so that they would not wake and hear him. Okay, so David crossed over to the other side and stood afar on top of a hill. There was considerable distance between them, and that's to tell us that he put himself back in safety, or relative safety, and yet he's on top of the hill so he can yell out to the camp below and they will hear him. And David shouted to the troops and to Abner, son of Ner, Abner, aren't you going to answer? And Abner shouted back, who are you to shout at the king? And David answered Abner, you are a man, aren't you? And there is no one like you in Israel. So why don't you keep watch over your lord the king? For one of our troops came to do violence to your lord the king. You have not given a good account of yourself. As the Lord lives, all of you deserve to die because you did not keep watch over your lord, the Lord's anointed. Look around. Where are the king's spear and the water jar that were at his head? So here David turns around, turns the whole episode on his head. So first of all, and rightly so, he accuses Abner and the entire army of being derelict in their job. Well, what do you mean? We came in and we could have killed the king. Where were you? Kind of thing. But what's very interesting is that he says, all of you deserve to die because you did not keep watch over your Lord, the Lord's anointed. So in the same reason he says that because he's a Lord's anointed, he won't kill him. He's now accusing Abner of being derelict in his duty. He has a special duty to protect the king. He's just not an ordinary king. He's the Lord's anointed. So he's using this idea of the Lord's anointed in both directions. Saul recognized David's voice and he asked, is that your voice, my son David? Well, this is the height of schizophrenia. He has come now with 3,000 men to kill David. And then when he hears his voice, it like awakens this enormous sympathy and kindness in him. And he calls him my son David. Okay, now let's go back to what we saw before in chapter 24. Okay, we're going back to the story of the cave in En-Gedi. And we're comparing these two stories. Chapter 24, verse 17. When David finished saying these things to Saul, now here's a difference, okay? In our story, in chapter 26, David is actually addressing Abner. He doesn't address Saul. And Saul then hears his voice. In chapter 24, David addresses Saul directly. So verse 17. When David finished saying these things to Saul, Saul said, is that your voice, my son David? And Saul broke down and wept. He said to David, you are right, not I, for you have treated me generously, but I've treated you badly. Here, scripture uses the identical words. Is that your voice, my son David? But he doesn't break down and weep. And David replied, it is my Lord King. And he went on, but why does my Lord continue to pursue his servant? What have I done? And what wrong am I guilty of? Now let my Lord the King hear his servant out. If the Lord has incited you against me, let him be appeased by an offering. But if it is men, may they be accursed of the Lord, for they have driven me out today, so that I cannot have a share in the Lord's possession. But I'm told, go and worship other gods. What is that about? Okay, so let's analyze this a little bit. First of all, he begins in verse 18. On the one hand, you have the king being very kind and he doesn't break down and weep, but he calls him my son, and it's a very moving moment. Okay, and if we go back to chapter 24 again, we see, let me see, when David starts to speak again. No, he doesn't have to speak, because what happens is Saul himself immediately at that point tells him, you have just revealed how generously you've treated me. If a man meets his enemy, does he let him go his way unharmed? Surely the Lord will reward you generously for what you have done. You have Saul immediately not only breaking down and weeping, but continuing to speak to David and speaking words of warmth and kindness. Whereas here, the only thing Saul says is that your voice, my son David. But here, I think also that David doesn't let him get any more words in before he immediately says, what do you have against me? Okay. And here he says something very important. Okay. He says, he gives him two options. He says, if the Lord has incited you against him, let him be appeased by an offering. Okay. And basically what it's saying, if there's some reason, and I think that what he's saying is, let him be appeased by an offering, I will bring an offering. David's saying, if it's the Lord who has incited you, it must be because I have done some wrong to the Lord, and therefore I will bring an offering. Okay. But we know that's not the case. And David knows it, and Saul knows it. Okay. So then he goes to the other option. But if it is men who have incited you against, may they be accursed of the Lord. So here you get a sense for the first time that David suspects that there are men in Saul's entourage, in his court, and there are commentators who say this must be Abner. Okay? Because beforehand, when he accuses Abner in a sort of ironic way, you haven't appropriately watched over your king, he tells him you will be punished. And so putting those two together, there is a sense here that David is accusing or suspects that Abner, indeed, it's not God who is inciting Saul against him. It is Abner, or it is at least people, human beings in his entourage. Okay, but then what does he say? What is he saying the men have effectively done? By inciting Saul against David, he says, for they have driven me out today so that I cannot have a share in the Lord's possession. And possession, I'm not sure is the right word. It's in the Lord's territory is the word. Nachala in Hebrew, the territory. It's a word used for territory, for a portion of land. When the tribes of Israel come in to the land under Joshua and they conquer the land, each tribe is given a nachala, a portion or a territory. It's not just some gift from God. It's a piece of land. And so what he's saying is that effectively, what these people have done by inciting Saul against me, they have driven me out of the land. And then he says, by driving me out of the land, effectively they're saying to me, go worship strange gods, go worship pagan gods. And that, of course, is a big question. What he's saying here, by the way, and we'll see it afterwards being played out, basically what David is saying now, he is realizing that despite Saul's kind words now, or at least by calling him my son, learning from the experience he had in En Gedi, he realizes this is not going to help. Tomorrow, Those same insiders are going to be after him, or whatever it is that it's inciting Saul, okay? And actually, there are some commentators that say it is God who's inciting Saul, that evil spirit that we talked about at the very beginning when Saul starts to be weird about all of this. So that could come from God, but clearly coming from God, not because of the sin of David, but because of his displeasure with Saul. But be that as it may, whatever the actual thing is, what we're saying here, though, is that David is essentially hinting, I realize now, okay, that there's not going to be any reconciliation between us. No matter what you say, tomorrow you'll be chasing me again. And therefore, I have no choice but to leave the land. What does that mean, to leave the land? He is saying it's leaving God's land. And these statements here, leaving God's land, and how important that is something that forms the cornerstone of the relationship of the Jewish people and the land of Israel. It's not just the God that says, I'm giving you the land and this is my territory and I have the land and I'll give it to who I want. And you have statements like that throughout the Bible, okay? But here we have this sense that when you leave the land, you're leaving God's land. And therefore, it is almost as if you are going to become a pagan worshiper, an idol worshiper. Now, there's no question, David is never going to be an idol worshiper, okay? But what does this actually mean? So there's a few ways of seeing it. One is that if you're leaving God's territory, even though you continue to worship God, you're distanced from God, and it's as if there's a strangeness there that can set in, okay? Another explanation, the more common explanation, is that when you're going to other lands, you're going to lands where pagan worship is the norm. The people of Israel are unique in ancient times in that they worship the one God of Israel. Every other nation surrounding them is immersed in pagan worship. So if you're leaving God's land and going to a different land where they are immersed in pagan worship, even if you yourself are not worshiping their gods, you are going to a place that it's surrounding you. It kind of infects you in a certain way. And that is how this verse is being interpreted. But for us, for me, for example, growing up in the United States, this idea of coming home to Israel, it wasn't just like fulfilling prophecy. It wasn't just coming to my homeland where I feel most at home. It was coming to God's land. It's like when you're living outside of Israel as a Jew, I don't think this is the same for non-Jews because God's land was given to us as a territory. I do think that everybody all over the world feels closer to God when they're in the land of Israel. But for a Jew, there's that element of your territory that was given to you by God. And this is where you belong. And if you're not there, there's going to be a distance, some kind of distance between you and God that should not be there. Okay. And so this is, I think what David is representing becomes really something very, very critical in the way the Jewish people view the land of Israel. Okay, verse 20. Oh, let my blood not fall to the ground away from the presence of the Lord. For the king of Israel has come out to sing a single flea as if you were hunting a partridge in the hills. Okay. And he is basically, on the one hand, you could say he's kind of asking Saul, don't kill me. But it could also be a statement. He's saying, my blood will not fall because I am in the presence of God. God is watching over me. Okay. It's at the same time that he's criticizing Saul. He's basically saying to Saul, okay, you want to kill me, but God's not going to let you kill me because you're doing this in the presence of God. And Saul answered, I am in the wrong. Come back, my son David, for I will never harm you again, seeing how you have held my life precious this day. Yes, I've been a fool, and I have erred so very much. David replied, here is your majesty's spear. Let one of the young men come over and get it. He is not going to take a chance to even himself go and give him the spear. That's how little he trusts Saul's statement of regret, okay? He says, let one of your men come and get it for me. And the Lord will requite every man for his right conduct and loyalty. For this day the Lord delivered you into my hands, and I would not raise a hand against the Lord's anointed. And just as I valued your life highly this day, so may the Lord value my life, and may he rescue me from all trouble. So this comes on the heels of what he said before, okay? He is not going to be killed by Saul because the Lord is protecting him, and he's adding this request to God. Saul answered David, may you be blessed, my son David, you shall achieve, and you shall prevail. David then went his way, and Saul returned home. Now, if we just look at the first verse of the next chapter, we can see how David didn't trust a word that Saul said, and with good reason. David said to himself, someday I shall certainly perish at the hands of Saul. The best thing for me is to flee to the land of the Philistines. Saul will then give up hunting me throughout the territory of Israel, and I will escape him. Okay, and then the next few chapters that we're going to discuss will show him in the land of the Philistines. Now let me just see if there's one thing that I didn't. No. Oh, one thing that I wanted to mention with regard to this idea of being outside the land of Israel, being like a pagan whatever. And I mentioned this is a linchpin of so much of our attitude. There's actually a statement in the Talmud. Now, the Talmud was written in like the 5th century, approximately. Statement would have been made earlier, but it was actually gathered. These statements over the previous few centuries are gathered together in this text called the Talmud, and that is finished in like the 5th century. Okay? So we're talking about many, many centuries after King David. And the Talmud makes a statement basing it on this chapter, these verses that we just read. He who lives outside the land of Israel is as if he is worshiping pagan gods. Now, I don't think that means that somebody changes his belief, but I think what it comes to say is that you have created a distance between yourself and God of Israel. So there's a certain strangeness in your relationship with God. And of course, that is as a statement meant to say, get back to Israel, you Jews. Well, we wish that all the Jews around the world would listen to that statement, but it's certainly the motivation behind many, many Jews who come back to Israel. So here we have David leaving the land, not because he wants to, but because he has no choice, and he really doesn't have choice. Now, what is the connection between putting this verse? I started out by saying I believe that the last verse of 25 really, not I believe, but the way the original Masoretic text has the last verse of 25 as the beginning of this story. Because what has happened already, okay? Now, the last time, two things have changed from the story in chapter 24, okay? After this chapter 24, where you feel like, oh, maybe there's some kind of reconciliation, the first verse of chapter 25 tells us that Samuel has died. Now, at the end of 25, we learn that Saul has given Michal to someone else. Two things have happened. Number one, Samuel has died. It's very possible that Saul felt a little more, or at least David might have felt, that he had some level of protection because Samuel is still around. Does Saul want to come up against Samuel in such a direct way? Samuel has anointed Saul, Samuel anointed David, and perhaps he feels that there's a certain level of protection in the very fact that Samuel is alive. Well, Samuel then dies. But here, by giving Michal to someone else, Saul has severed the family relation that he had with Michal. And if you remember, we talked about this at the beginning of this whole story. Saul is so jealous of David, losing his kingdom to David. But when David and Michal are married, what that means is that even if David becomes king, David's children will be Saul's grandchildren. So that marriage in and of itself should have put aside any of that jealousy, because the marriage of those two families meant that even if David would become king and not Jonathan, Saul's grandchildren would be next in line. And so there still would be a connection to the house of Saul. Here, even though at the in the end of chapter 24, Saul seems to say, I will never harm you, you will never harm me, our two families will continue to exist. And you remember, whoa, wait, there is still that marriage. Here, this story begins telling us Now, Saul has already severed that family connection. He has given Michal to someone else. We're going to study Michal later on. She becomes an interesting figure back in David's life. But I think this is the relevance here, that as if scripture is trying to tell us, no, Saul cannot be trusted. Even though he may speak lovely words, he has severed his family connection to David. He has severed any possibility that David's children will be Saul's grandchildren, and so it's all out war. And that's where we're at as he goes off to the Philistines. Okay, any questions?
Thank you for that last point about the whole identity of Jewish people being with the land. When you said that, it made me think of a phrase that's often used in the Old Testament, which is where God has chosen to put his name. And you get that little phrase, chosen to put, and you get it in Deuteronomy,
And yeah, many times in that.
Chronicles, yeah. And it's always God has chosen to put his name in Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem is in Israel. And so therefore, if you're not there, you are not where he's chosen to put his name. And I think that really is reinforced in 1 Kings 8, where Solomon is saying, you know, if people have sinned or gone out to battle, or if they're not even around, if they look towards this place, the holy place where you've chosen to put your name, then forgive them. So I can understand that, you know, if you're not there, you're not there. So
that's very nice. And it's very interesting that you mentioned Solomon's prayer, because what he does essentially is the prayer itself is a set of concentric circles, where it goes from the people who are closest physically to people in Jerusalem, people in the land of Israel but are not in Jerusalem, people who are outside the land of Israel, and then the Gentiles, who are from other places. And basically it's creating a situation where Jerusalem is the heart that everybody from wherever they are looking towards. But it gives Jerusalem being the center of Israel, there's no question. In Israel, it's still part of that Jerusalem, whereas there's a difference if you leave Israel.
And then going into the New Testament, that theme of where God has chosen to put his name in his people. So then the discussion is the people. But there is a really strong theme throughout scripture of that, as you say, of that, the land.
Yeah.
I do have one question. I was interested in and I noticed my sister picked up on it last week, I wasn't there, on your word of king, Melech, or the other one, which I forget.
Nagid.
Yeah, captain. And I noticed in this chapter that you've read today that David is calling Saul king, Melech, and yet God called David in previous chapters captain or ruler.
We also have David being called king. We have both, and that's what we were talking about. I don't know, last week or whenever it was, 2 weeks ago. I think
that's when God says He's found Himself a king.
Right, it'll be a king for him. Right.
Yeah.
But what happens is, Saul is definitely a king, and God initially, and his initial conversation with Samuel is to kind of have a king, but with perhaps less authoritarian type of responsibility. So that's the use of the word Nagid. But he is king, and David's emphasis here is that he is an anointed king. And so it kind of connects with how God says about David, a king for me. And that's David's perspective. If God anointed the king, then God placed him in that position for him. And if God wants to remove him, he'll remove him because he's God's king. And what he's rejecting here is any idea of one dynasty. In the ancient times, the only way dynasties changed hands is when somebody else came along, killed the king, made sure to kill all of his descendants. They didn't leave a descendant alive because then he would take over, kill all the descendants, wipe out the whole house, and then this other guy becomes the new king, and his family becomes the new dynasty. And so David is making very clear he may one day become king, but it's not because he is going to be killing the previous king and all his descendants, which is clearly what Saul is worried about. Because earlier in chapter 24, he made him promise, don't kill my descendants. Don't kill my house, and David promised he wouldn't. So you have here that conflict between the general vision of a king and God's king. And God's king, or the anointed of God, that's a whole different ballgame. And that's what David is saying to Saul.
Reinforce. Okay, thank you.
In the future, not only the Jews will be going back to Israel, everybody else will be going there as well.
I don't think everybody will be living there. All
will be going up to Jerusalem.
Yes, absolutely.
Isaiah, and that's too.
Isaiah, exactly. Such a beautiful, and then of course it will be a whole different time, because instead of all the nations around Israel becoming pagan lands, they will be lands that all, doesn't matter from the four corners of the earth, will all be looking towards Jerusalem as their center, and they all will recognize God as king. So that's a whole different ballgame, but we're not there yet.
We may not be too far. We hope we won't be too far.
No, we're not too far. Well, it's interesting, because
we're both impatient about this, Sondra. Carol and I are really, really impatient about this.
Well, you have to look at baby steps. I mean, first of all, we do not live in a pagan world today. Okay, there's still some pagan worship, but it's definitely not prevalent. And, most people in the world believe in one God. The question is not anymore whether you believe in one God, but whether you attribute pagan attributes to your God. And that is where I would say that where some of the Muslims kind of go off kilter, because they do believe in one God who created the universe, but they've ascribed, in many cases, okay, I can't say all Muslims are like this, but certainly the prevalent Islamic whatever that we see today is that, and that's really our biggest challenge today. If you think about the war that we're engaged in right now, and I think nothing like the events of October 7th highlight that, okay? That it doesn't matter. These people did what they did in the name of a belief in a God, okay? But anybody who would murder, rape, torture, and everything else that they did, human beings, in the name of a God, is not believing in the God of Israel. They have a different skewed view, right? And so I think on the one hand you could say, well, we're moving closer. People are not bowing down to stone and wood, and they're not, bowing down to the stars and the moon and I don't know what. But on the other hand, we have a long way to go.
I've just been in India for a month. I feel I have been personally jostled by 1.4 billion people. And believe me, there's paganism there.
Yes, there is. Yes, there's no question. There are pockets in different parts of the world.
I was overwhelmed. The Diwali, the whole thing, the whole worshipping. Nate, I didn't know what paganism was until I went.
Right. I've heard that said about people who go to India.
Overwhelming.
Yeah. Although there are Christians in India, and especially in the South.
2%.
Right. But it's very interesting, because we have quite a number of foreign workers who come from India as caretakers for our elderly and ill, and there's quite a lot of them who come from a province in the south of India called Kerala. And all the ones I've met there are Christians, everyone.
Yeah, that's because of the background of the empire with the whole as you go really south, it's away from the Mughal, i.e. the Muslim influence, which brings us back to your point again. So the whole of the northern sections, which is all the main Hindu, Buddhism, Jainism, and it's all based around the same pagan beliefs. So, yeah.
Back to what you were saying about the Muslims, Sondra. I don't actually think it would take an awful lot for them to be skewed around to correct belief, because they have a sort of sobriety of a sort. They believe in one God.
Right.
They don't yet believe in the promises to Abraham. But if Abraham suddenly turned up, right, they would say, and he said to them, lads, you got that wrong. that wasn't your land. I gave you all of that.
Right.
And you
Israel-
want that as
Israel had his
well?
promise,
No,
yeah.
it's not yours. I tell you what, there would be such a change in their attitude. You will be amazed.
Well, you know what? I will never lose faith that things will come around. But I think it's also very difficult to look at Islam today from one perspective, because there are some Muslims who, not enough, not a lot, but some who were horrified at the depravity and evil of what we saw on October 7th. And that already is an important dividing line, okay? Because if you're able to say that is evil, okay, then I have much more optimism towards those people. Unfortunately, there's too many that are not saying it's evil. And one of the things that is most upsetting to me is if we go to the West with a Christian background, I'm not saying these are Christian people, but let's say people coming from a Christian heritage, what has happened to these people that they don't think that it's evil? I don't understand, maybe they're today they're atheists or whatever it is they are, but this is their heritage, and how can they say this is not evil? It's beyond understanding.
I think it's because of the point you made in your program thing on the 19th, which is about replacement theology and the whole
Yes.
thing. Israel is just not part of Christianity as it stands in the main today. And I think you've got a group of people here who see the Old Testament. There is no New Testament without the Old Testament,
Right.
And so if you do not get, I mean, Christ quotes Isaiah the whole time, what are you doing throwing out the Bible? Because most of Christ's words are from the Old Testament anyway. But that I don't think that is the common experience of most Christians. That's not
Right.
They don't get given that diet. They are denied that insight by those who lead them.
So we have to hope and pray that their eyes are opened. And it's very interesting because you could say read the Bible. That's not good enough, because if you read the Bible with coming with a baggage of prejudice and skewed views, you are going to see in the Bible what you want to see. So you need to kind of be able, and this is, I think, something to pray for, that God will kind of wipe the slate clean and enable them to just read the Bible as if it's the first thing they ever read. No preconceived notions. And then it becomes a place where they can start saying, oh, and then they see things very differently. But it's difficult.
You just need to get them to accept Genesis. Genesis is good
Just
enough.
the book.
It's great. It's all great.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Can I chip in and say, when you say about people, some of the countries I've been, for example, Pakistan, if you're born on that side of the street, you're Muslim. If you're born on that side of the street, you're Christian. But it doesn't mean to say that either of them believe in God, be it Allah, they're Allah, or they are Christian. They're just called Christian because they're not Muslim. So they're nothing. They don't really believe. They're just called that. And I think that's part of the problem. It's the same with the Buddhists and the Hindus. And literally, you say about pagan worship. I've been around quite a few countries, and I can remember turning around and you look, and there's this little tiny Buddha, and placed in front of him a bottle of Baileys and a nice plate of strawberries. And I think, that's daft. Why are they doing that? But then you realise it's a perversion of the Bible, because when you think that God came down over the cherubim, over the tabernacle, and to them, they're thinking that their God can come and inhabit that little statue. It's a perversion of the word of God in a way.
Right.
But yes, there's a lot of people, they're called.
Well, I think if there's one thing that God is extremely clear about, is that you should have no graven images. You should have no gods. You do not pray to man-made objects. It just flies in the face of everything we know about God. If you think God is above everything, created the world, then you can't imagine that this little statue that you yourself carved would be
Yeah.
a god. That just doesn't make any sense. You know, who made who? You know, God made the tree. The tree can't make the god. You know, it doesn't work. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah. I saw crazy things like cows defecating on the pavement and then people putting candles in it and praying to it and
oh,
and decorating it with bamboo. It's a thing.
oh my God.
Because of course the cow is the last reincarnation of the animal kingdom before it becomes a human being. And when you actually see all this going on, you just sort of think, what you do think is, why has God put up with this? Why hasn't he intervened? Why hasn't he done it already? How is it that he puts up with such paganism across the world over many, many generations? You know, we read of an impatient God in the Old Testament. So it does make me wonder sometimes, and the only conclusion I can come to is that God, as it says, he's long suffering, full of gracious mercy and truth, and he's long suffering, waiting for those to come to a true faith in him. That's the only conclusion I can come into.
But I think also, if you look at the Bible, God, when did God lose patience? Okay, Sodom, for example. And what was the problem in Sodom? It was depravity. It wasn't about what they believed in. It was about how they behaved. And so I think even though God is constantly warning the nation of Israel, don't you go off to pagan worship. On the other hand, he has far more patience for people who don't believe in him than he does in people who are carrying out evil. And I think that's what you see in places like India. They have ridiculous beliefs and activities, but they're not as a people doing evil things as a result of that. You know, there was a time when pagan worship called you to do evil things. And I think that's less today than our problem with people doing evil things are not the pagans. You know, there's some of these others.
I guess it
And I think
depends.
that's where God loses patience.
I think it's a whole other debate. It depends on your definition of evil, really, doesn't it? Because God sees sin as sin, and we tend to grade it, don't we? You know, all murderers.
No, I'm just looking at God's behavior. And there's no question there's sin and there's sin and there's sin, but there's also different levels of sin. But look at where God destroyed the world and for what? Okay. And I think that tells you something. Not that he says that pagan worship is great, but where does he destroy the world? It wasn't on pagan worship. It was on evil activities to people. You know,
It says
killing people.
mankind had corrupted it himself.
Right. So anyway, well, we got into some hot and heavy topics today. It was great as always. And I look forward to seeing you again next week.